It's Michael Popak with Legal AF. It's going to be a bad Christmas, probably, for Representative Scott Perry, Republican representative from the 10th District in Pennsylvania, which covers Harrisburg, a former Army retired brigadier general, and a prime suspect and leader of the Jan 6 insurrection. At least that is the conclusion, having now read through Judge Beryl Howell's release just this week of previously sealed memorandums of law that demonstrate that the Department of Justice is fast on the heels of Representative Perry. The Department of Justice, it is just disclosed this week, has been searching through over 100,000 emails that John Eastman, the former constitutional scholar for Donald Trump and the architect of many of his litigation schemes, and the one to have Mike Pence throw the entire election over to individual states to decide who would be the president, meaning Donald Trump. That guy, John Eastman, who lost in his bid to keep his emails secret under attorney-client privilege in turning them over to the Jan 6 committee, John Eastman, who had a federal judge, Judge Carter, declare that it was more likely than not that he, along with Donald Trump, committed federal crimes, including that of obstruction and conspiracy to interfere with an election process. That John Eastman also turned over 100,000 emails with Jeffrey Clark, who was this close to becoming the Attorney General of the United States by Donald Trump in the last 10 days of his presidency in order to execute Trump's plan to remain in power and not peacefully transfer to Joe Biden, along with his deputy, Ken Klukowski, a little-known attorney nobody's ever heard of, but was instrumental in helping Jeffrey Clark write some of the most momentous pieces of evidence that the Jan 6 committee and the Department of Justice have seen, being the letter that was going to be sent by the Department of Justice on their letterhead, signed by Jeffrey Clark, if he were the Attorney General, to Georgia to try to interfere with their election cycle and their election results, just as Donald Trump was calling the Secretary of State of Georgia to do exactly the same thing. The Department of Justice, having reviewed 100,000 emails belonging to John Eastman, all roads lead to Scott Perry. Let me repeat. The focus of all of these emails are at the hub of this wheel of conspiracy is Scott Perry, representative of Pennsylvania. He was the one that suggested to Donald Trump that he remove Jeff Rosen as the acting attorney general and replace him with Jeffrey Clark, because Jeffrey Clark would do whatever Donald Trump told him to do and perform another midnight massacre and remove all lawyers that were in Donald Trump's way and let him stay in office and lock the door to Joe Biden's peaceful transfer, becoming president of the United States. That Representative Scott Perry, the same Representative Scott Perry who has, to this date, is one of 4 members of Congress who has refused to provide testimony and evidence to the Jan 6 committee, to his fellow colleagues in the House, and will likely be reprimanded and censured by the House Ethics Committee before January 2nd. That Scott Perry, the same Scott Perry whose own cell phone was picked up in a raid and a search warrant execution in August of this past year. So in May of this year, you had 100,000 emails and the phones of John Eastman, Jeff Clark, and Ken Klukowski being picked up by the Department of Justice on a search warrant. And in August, you had Scott Perry having to finally turn over his phone the same way, all supervised by Beryl Howell, making sure the Department of Justice is dotting its I's and crossing its T's. And now the Department of Justice, having looked through these 100,000, the noose is tightening around Scott Perry, representative of Pennsylvania, leader of the House Freedom Caucus, and likely a target of the investigation by the Department of Justice. Now, I know Scott Perry and his representatives have come out and said he was never a target. I don't think that could be possibly true, given that the entire focus of the Department of Justice's review of John Eastman's emails and those of Klukowski and Clark is for their common links back to one Scott Perry, who had Donald Trump's ear, who met with Donald Trump in just after the election, in December, just before Jan 6th, and after Jan 6th, trying to devise a strategy for him to cling to power in a coup. For example, in the emails that were exchanged between Klukowski, who was on the payroll of the White House and therefore the American taxpayer at the time, Klukowski suggests to Perry that if a certain strategy is followed, one of these lame, too smart by half strategies devised by self-proclaimed constitutional scholar John Eastman, that the state legislators, the state houses of each state, could ultimately determine the election, not the electoral college voters and the electorate who are tied to the results of the popular vote in each state and the awarding of electoral votes. And if that were to happen, let me remind everybody that until the midterm election, the vast majority of each individual state house, state representatives, is controlled by Republicans around the country, not Democrats. And if you throw away the electoral college weighting of larger states versus smaller states, which is to the advantage of the Democrats because of the large urban centers in large states like California and New York, if you just throw it, every state from Wyoming to New York to California to Idaho all have the same ability, all have one vote, which is what Eastman's theory was, then Donald Trump would be president of the United States for a second term, not Joe Biden, because probably 35 to 40 state houses at that time were controlled by Republican and Republican governors and Republican state houses. So he would have won in a landslide of epic proportion by state legislature, each having one vote. This was the cockamamie theory, pipe dream of Donald Trump, John Eastman, Klukowski, Jeffrey Clark, and they had a guy on the inside job, Representative Scott Perry. I don't think it's a coincidence that Beryl Howell allowed the Department of Justice to ask for and receive all emails connected back to Scott Perry. If he's not currently a target, he will be very soon, and we won't be seeing the last of Scott Perry's name in the paper moving forward as the Jack Smith-driven, turbocharged Department of Justice prosecution and investigation continues. This is Michael Popak reporting on all roads leading back to Scott Perry, representative of the 10th District in Pennsylvania.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs, It Wasn't Rigged, You're Just a Loser, at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.